Let's see what Ezekiel has to say about this garden. I didn't know I was going to quote this. I get a lot heavier on this topic in my book Adam and Eve that's fixing to come out. But it looks like I'm covering it here as well, which is good. Ezekiel 31, it's been a while since I've read this. I've written so much. I've got 10 books published. I can't remember everything that I wrote in these books beforehand. And it's been a while since I visited this book, New Jerusalem. Anyways, Ezekiel 31, verses 1 through 7. It came to pass in the 11th year, in the 3rd month, the 1st day of the month, that the word of the Lord came unto me, saying, Son of man, speaking to Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and to his multitude, who are you like in your greatness? Behold, the Assyrian was a cedar in Lebanon, with fair branches and with a shattering shroud, comparing a nation to a tree, and of a high stature, and his top was among the thick boughs. The waters made him great. The Assyrian nation, this is a message to Pharaoh, king of Egypt. The waters made him great. The deep set him up on high, with her rivers running about his plants, sent out her little rivers into all the trees of the field. This is metaphoric language, comparing people and nations to trees. Again, I get real heavy about this topic in the book I'm writing now on Adam and Eve, that's going to be published soon. Necessarily so, because I'm directly dealing with those topics. Therefore his height was exalted above all the trees of the field. Again, Assyria was exalted above all the other trees, the other nations, the other peoples, and his boughs were multiplied, and his branches became long because of the multitude of waters when he shot forth. All the fowls of heaven made their nests in his boughs. And again, this is something I'm going to go over in Adam and Eve, comparing even animals to people, metaphorically speaking, not naturalistically speaking. All the fowls of heaven made their nests in his boughs, and under his branches did all the beasts of the field bring forth their young. And under his shadow dwelt all great nations. Thus was he fair in his greatness, and the length of his branches, for his root was by great waters. Now here we have a real message for the king of Egypt, but presented in metaphors. The allegories are very obvious here. However, in the next upcoming verses, things start sounding even stranger, especially if we're trying to read this naturalistically. Again, we have to look at this metaphorically in order to understand this. Ezekiel 31, verse 8. The cedars in the garden of God could not hide him. The fir trees were not like his boughs. The chestnut trees were not like his branches. Nor any tree in the garden of God was like unto him in his beauty. And just so that we know that we are not mistaken in what garden Ezekiel's talking about, Ezekiel makes a bold declaration in verse 9. I have made him fair by the multitude of his branches, so that all the trees of Eden, which were in the garden of God, had envied him, the Syrian nation. What's so confusing is the fact that the garden, if it were a natural garden at all, surely would have been destroyed by the flood of Noah. Again, 2 Peter 3:6. But if not destroyed by that worldwide deluge, and we are certainly seeing Eden being spoken of here many, many years after the early chapters of Genesis, again, in Ezekiel's day, then what could this prophet possibly have been meaning? After all, during Adam's day, neither Egypt nor Assyria were established nations. The folks who founded those great kingdoms weren't even born yet. So just what is going on anyway? Surely Ezekiel couldn't have been delusional. For if we think about it, including both of those nations, which were many, many miles apart from one another, would have enlarged that garden, again, if it were a natural place, to a great expanse of size. From which thought some have even believed that the entire planet itself was the Garden of Eden. Now, again, here I'm skipping along the surface to get to a certain point about what's in this book. But again, in Adam and Eve, my book, fixing to come out, I'm going to expand on this even more. So let me just tell you the conclusions right quick. The entire planet was a global garden. It really was. But the planet was not the Garden of Eden that we see in chapter 2 of Genesis. The global garden was created in Genesis chapter 1. So therefore, what we see in chapter 1 of Genesis was the natural creation, just like the creationists teach on. And I believe that it was created naturalistically, as we see in Genesis chapter 1. But Genesis chapter 2 talks about a spiritual garden. So therefore, the garden that was created in chapter 1 of Genesis, that got destroyed, turned to mud during the flood of Noah. But the garden that we see in chapter 2 was a spiritual garden, so therefore the floodwaters couldn't touch it. That's why it was still in existence during John the Revelator's day, when he was talking about the paradise of God, the tree of life being there. It had nothing to do with the natural planet at all. So I contend here, as I'm fixing to show in my book on Adam and Eve, that there's two different gardens, one natural, one spiritual. So that explains this very simply. And that's where here I'm kind of toying with the idea in this book, getting ready to expound upon it, which I finally am doing. So this was several years ago. And so I'm just explaining what I was doing here, was getting ready for the book that I'm fixing to publish. Finally getting to it. So anyways, however, and despite several forwarded ideas, I myself believe that Garden Eden was not a natural garden, but instead was God's present work on this earth during the Old Testament period. Again, that spiritual garden. But I do have an explanatory note, so I may get a little bit more into it here. So this explanatory note is, I myself believe that the Garden of Eden was not a natural garden. Most, if not all, of the creationist teachers, which I just got through speaking on in the other explanatory note and gave the website for, called 2 Peter 3:6, whereby the world that then was being overflowed with water had perished. They believe that the Garden of Eden was a natural garden, globally. Not only so, but was globally large instead of just occupying a small corner in the Middle Eastern part of the earth, wherever Adam and Eve had lived. And again, in my book on Adam and Eve, I actually agree that the natural garden was also called Eden, because the spiritual garden had to have a natural counterpart. Because in many cases, before we can have a spiritual counterpart, we have to see the natural first. Again, in my new book, I finally explained that the area that Adam and Eve lived in, they called that Eden. And then later, the spiritual garden was synonymous with it and became known as the Garden of Eden spiritually, as a counterpart to the natural garden country that Adam and Eve had lived in. So it really wasn't the whole globe that was Eden. It was the area that Adam and Eve had lived in, which they called Eden. Because you remember later, their son Cain went to a land that was named Nod. And in my book, Adam and Eve, I explained that it's Cain himself that called it Nod. So it wasn't Eden. It was a different area on the earth. Anyways, let's get back to this. Not only so, but was globally large instead of just occupying a small corner in the Middle Eastern part of the earth. As one's going to see, I do not agree with everything that those men teach. Not only that, but they themselves don't always agree with each other anyway. But does that make them all wrong in their calculations? No, it doesn't. They're merely trying to solve a 6,000 to 10,000 year old mystery and are doing the best that they can by matching earth sciences with scripture. And they're all doing a great job. Though, and despite popular belief, that does not mean that they are scrambling around desperately trying to prove the Bible right and the real scientists wrong. Most of these men are credentialed scientists themselves. Even Dr. Walt Brown had worked for NASA for many years before he got into this, which the intelligence of his monumental book called In the Beginning, Compelling Evidence for Creation and the Flood, which I give the website where you can find that. He's got the whole textbook online, could alone prove. They've merely found a better model in which to work from, the Bible. And when starting their premise from that model, their conclusions, they really do make better sense, not only toward earth sciences, but with history itself even. Be that as it may, and even though the entire planet was a natural paradise from the beginning, that I will certainly agree with, they failed to mention where the Garden of Eden is located at today. With such a mystery, one could either have to conclude that the garden, if natural, would have perished with the floodwaters of Noah, and the natural counterpart did, or that the garden was only a metaphor, which the spiritual one was, albeit having very real events, results, and consequences. Or if it were natural to begin with, I'm talking about the spiritual garden now, if that one was natural, then how does it show up again in the book of Ezekiel chapter 31 verse 9, during the middle of the Old Testament period, and then once again in Revelation chapter 2 verse 7, during the New Testament period? In all these considerations, we have to remember the two cherubim with the flaming sword, Genesis 3:24. So he, God, drove out the man Adam and placed at the east of the Eden garden cherubim with a flaming sword which turned every way to keep the way of the tree of life. Now, even if we believe that the flaming sword somehow covers the garden from natural sight, it still is not attached to the natural world, making it once again something spiritual. But even if one were to believe that it's still a natural garden today, being again hidden behind the flaming sword, shielding it from natural sight, then I would have to ask, how in the world did the Egyptians and the Syrians lived in it as it was expressed by Ezekiel? How's that possible? If we're going to continue to build my case, we're going to see how that the Garden of Eden had to be spiritual rather than natural. Again, from Genesis chapter 2, not chapter 1. There's a big difference between those. So going back to the main part of the book. So I'm going to say this again. I myself believe that the Garden of Eden that we see in Genesis chapter 2 was not a natural garden, but was instead the beginning of God's present work on this earth during the Old Testament period, starting with Adam and Eve. Not only his work, but all the folks who wandered on through, or rather who had lived in the massive spiritual garden, were the folks of whom God was working with. Can we imagine God only working with the Israelites during the old time frame of the Old Testament? If so, why would he have been concerned enough for Nineveh to have Jonah to go there and to preach to them to the saving of their lives? No, friends, the garden got much, much bigger than what Adam had lived in the first part of Genesis. Again, we see this going all the way down to Ezekiel's day, included Egypt, included Assyria. There's more to this Garden of Eden than what is being taught. Again, I get nitty-gritty with the details in my new upcoming book on Adam and Eve.